Hello, my name is Jackie Pichette. I manage HECO Center for Learning Outcomes Assessment, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first edition of our 2018 Spring Webinar Series. Each webinar in this series will focus on skill development and assessment. For this first webinar, we've invited Lisa Phillips and Norah McRae to lend their expertise about overcoming some of the challenges of offering work-integrated learning experiences to post-secondary students in Ontario. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website shortly after the day. We have 1 hour with you today. We'll invite Lisa and Norah to present for the first 30 minutes, and then we'll open the virtual floor to questions. My colleague Danielle will explain more about that in just a moment, but before we get going, I'd like to tell you a bit about our organization. So HECO is an agency of the Ontario government. We were created in 2005 on the heels of Bob Rae's report, which reviewed post-secondary education in Ontario and recommended that an independent body be established to monitor the post-secondary system and provide policy advice to government. We do that. We conduct research relating to 3 priorities. The first is access. We look at improving access to higher education for underrepresented groups and providing supports to ensure all students have a chance to succeed once there. We also look at quality, which we define in terms of learning outcomes. What do Ontario post-secondary students know and what can they do? At HECO, we look at 4 overarching types of learning outcomes. The first is disciplinary knowledge. We also look at basic cognitive skills such as literacy and numeracy, as well as higher order cognitive skills such as problem solving and transferable skills such as teamwork and time management. Finally, we look at system design, where we ask how and whether the Ontario post-secondary system can be more efficient without compromising on access or quality. We often work in partnership with Ontario's colleges and universities to conduct research relating to our 3 priorities. All of this research is public and available on our website. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Danielle.
Thanks, Jackie. We define work-integrated learning, or WIL, as the process through which students come to learn from experience in educational and practical settings, through curriculum and pedagogy that integrates learning experience in both of these settings. At HECO, we're long-standing fans of WIL. We've done research on students, faculty, and employers' views of WIL, legal implications to WIL, and a typology of WIL activities. We view WIL experiences as falling within 3 categories. Structured work experience, where the work experience is a component of the academic program. Institutional partnerships, where the activity or program is offered by the institution and designed to achieve specific industry or community goals. And systematic training, where the learning occurs in the workplace. And we recognize 7 types of WIL experiences sorted within these 3 categories, as you see here. Field experience, mandatory professional practice, co-op, internship, applied research projects, service learning, and apprenticeships. We view a good WIL experience as one that gives students meaningful opportunities to apply their learning. It's not about fetching coffee. In a successful WIL experience, it's important that students have the appropriate opportunity to foster and develop the skills they need to succeed in today's jobs and labor market. We'll now move to our 2 panelists. You are welcome to type questions, as Carly said, into the chat box during both presentations, and we'll get to them afterward for our group discussion. We're pleased to have Dr. Norah McRae speak first on learning outcomes assessment in WIL. Norah is Executive Director of the Cooperative Education Program and Career Services, the Director of the Office of Community University Engagement, and an adjunct faculty member at the University of Victoria. Her involvement in cooperative education, work-integrated learning, and community engagement spans more than 20 years, over which time she has led strategic program development and research on student engagement, work-integrated learning, and intercultural competency development. Her doctoral research examined conditions that enable transformative learning during work-integrated learning and led to the development of a preliminary theoretical model. Norah is a faculty member for the WACE Planning Institute for Global and Experiential Education, the WACE Assessment Institute, the Global WIL Program, and an adjunct in the Faculty of Education at UVic, where she teaches a graduate course in community engaged learning. In 2017, WACE awarded Norah the Donald McLaren Jr. Academic Award for Professional Achievement in Cooperative and Work Integrated Education. So over to you, Norah.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for that introduction. I greatly appreciate it. I wanted to, first of all, move into my first slide. Here we go. And start with what we in the Cooperative Education and Work Integrated Learning Association of Canada are using at this point in time as our working definition of will. And I do appreciate the definition that HECO has produced and also the terrific research that HECO has done in this space. It's truly wonderful. Thank you for that. But just as a starting point, and this is not a finalized definition for our association, and this is not the opportunity to debate it, but just to set the stage for the remainder of my comments. The working definition that we're anticipating or we're playing with at this point in time is that work integrated learning is a model and process of education which formally and intentionally integrates a student's academic studies within a workplace or practice setting. Curricular will can occur at the course or program level and includes the development of learning outcomes related to employability, personal agency, and lifelong learning. Now, given that definition and what we know about work integrated learning, we also know that this type of learning is a very exciting type of educational program, but it's also very challenging, and there are a number of complexities associated with it, and specifically as it relates to the assessment of learning outcomes, which is the focus of my presentation today. And I've identified at a very high level some of these challenges. I mean, first of all, as stated in both the HECO and our definition, the learning is occurring in a workplace or practice setting. So it's not occurring in a traditional academic environment. The learning outcomes that we seek as a result of will are very complicated. They relate to academic growth and development, personal growth and development, career growth and development, and these are often very difficult to assess. There usually is a consideration of the alignment of will learning outcomes with whatever learning outcomes the institution, the program, or the professional body they have identified. When we get into how we actually assess, we are often wanting to involve the employer and the student in that process, and there are challenges with those two players and how their familiarity with assessment and learning outcomes and how to engage in a process in a meaningful way. Good assessment, as we all know, requires critical reflection, and as we all know, that's not always easy to do, and it's not something that's superficial and trivial if it's done properly, and so setting the stage for appropriate reflection is a challenge. And then there's the question of scalability for those of us who are running large programs. So given those considerations, the University of Victoria in about 2008, 2009 started to think about how can we develop a process to address some of those challenges and be able to assess the learning that's happening as a result of our programs. And our programs, just a bit of context about the University of Victoria here. Our programs span, we did about 4,000, the predominant form of will is co-op, but we also have internships, we have work experience of various sorts, we have community service learning, and we have the co-curricular record. So there's a variety of programming within the will domain and across every discipline. So we have 224 accredited co-op programs in every faculty, all 10 faculties, everything from engineering to fine arts, including law and social sciences, the whole works. We have a co-op at the undergraduate and graduate level. So we have a very diverse program. So how could we set up an assessment model that would work across all of those disciplines and program areas? We were very interested in answering the question, or helping students answer the question, what they have learned as a result of their experiences, and for us to be able to discern what they have learned and be able to articulate that, both to them, for students to be able to articulate that to themselves and also potential employers. We wanted a process that could be scalable and could fit in with standard will processes where students are being assessed at the mid and the end term, and the employers are involved in that. We wanted something that developed reflective and strategic thinking skills, which sets the stage for students if they've developed those skills and those capabilities for their lifelong learning, and also something that could facilitate portfolio development. So what we did is we set up this competency framework. And as I said, we started this process in around 2009, 2010. And we came up with 3 main categories of competencies. We call the first category the core, and many of these are the cognitive and transferable skills that you have identified in the the introduction to the HECO work. So you can see in the core a standard set of 10 competencies that we feel are appropriate for all students, regardless of their discipline, regardless of whether or not they're undergraduate or graduate students, and of course the depth of their attainment of these capabilities would differ. Then there's a set of intercultural competencies, and this is based on the research work that we've done out of our unit on the conceptual framework of cultural intelligence, which is about the capabilities that individuals need to be effective in intercultural settings. And cultural intelligence is based on these 4 intercultural capabilities: strategic thinking, intercultural knowledge, intercultural motivation, and appropriate behavior. And then we also have a set of competencies that are at the program level, or disciplinary skills, if you will, and these are coming from programs. So here are some examples: marketing acumen from business, electrical engineering would have reliability, safety, and failure analysis, for example, and history has identified social and cultural perspective. So our competency framework is based on these 3 main categories, and students then assess themselves at the beginning of each experience, whether it's a co-op, a work experience, an internship, a service learning, or a co-curricular record. Students identify what core competencies they're going to work on, and then at the or they're intercultural or discipline specific, so they set some goals. At the midpoint, they self-assess their development, and they provide also qualitative commentary to provide evidence of that. Then that goes to their employer or their host organization supervisor, who then provides their assessment of students' capabilities, as well as providing qualitative commentary, and then that's repeated at the end. So their learning outcomes set at the beginning, and then midpoint, final point assessment, both from the student, from the employer, and all of this is mediated by the co-op and career staff. So what I wanted to show you is some data from 2017. So this is data just from the co-op work terms, and this is based on the first of those core: personal management. You can see that here. So it's a personal management competency. You can see at the beginning of the work term, the students had this sort of rating. So 51% said they were developing, 35% said they were accomplished at the beginning of the work term. At the midpoint, you can see this dial here, this accomplished dial, and this color here is exemplary. That dial is shifting. Students are now saying at the midpoint, and this is self-assessed, that 45% feel that they're accomplished. And you can see at the end, 59% feel accomplished and 12% the exemplary. So in students' self-assessment, they are articulating development of this competency over the course of that semester, and they provide commentary for it. Now, the first pushback we often will hear is that, of course, students will self-assess them very highly, assess themselves in a very high way. But there's lots of research and evidence that shows that that's actually not the case. And if you look at the employer data, so this is the supervisor midterm, note how the employers at the midpoint actually rate the students higher here, and again at the end here. So at the end, supervisors' final rating of the students, 23% of them are saying they're exemplary, versus 12% of the students are saying themselves are exemplary. So we have this data for all of the core and intercultural competencies for all students, for all programs, and I can slice and dice this by competency, by faculty, by program. And it gives us a very interesting way of looking at the development of our students' capabilities over the course of their progress. And we see these trends very consistently. The dial shifting, and employers basically as third-party validators indicating that, in fact, yes, the students do have the capabilities that they claim to have. This is an example of some of the qualitative commentary that comes from the students when they say, yes, I'm accomplished. Well, how do you know you're accomplished? And then they break that down, because we also want them to be able to talk about this with employers in the future, so their subsequent positions or their grad school applications or whatever it is they're planning to do. And we also want them, where possible, to be able to put evidence of their accomplishments in portfolios, whatever that might look like, whether it's an actual portfolio, an e-portfolio, some kind of a website, whatever, so that they're continuing to document their growth and development and their capabilities and be able to articulate those to others. Because one of the problems we know is that students have many capabilities, but they have a hard time recognizing them and they have a hard time communicating them to others. And part of our goal with this framework is to help students move further along that. The other benefit that we didn't expect at the beginning, but which has proven to be very substantial from this data, is we are able to take the data from the learning outcomes from students in two particular programs, engineering and business, that use the data then as evidence for the achievement of learning outcomes that they use to document for their accreditation processes. So the Faculty of Engineering uses our data for their Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board accreditations. All of our engineering programs are a mandatory co-op, by the way, and we have a very large graduate co-op at the engineering level, but undergrad co-op is what's being accredited, and they use that data. And the Gustafson School of Business uses our data for, they are accredited by two bodies, WSIB and HEQCO. And they use the data from the business students because our business program is also mandatory. All the BCom undergraduate students, all of them do co-op. And so that provides them with very robust data, as well as the evidence from the employers that they use to their benefit when they're applying for accreditation. And that is basically it. And I'd welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norah. We'll now turn to Professor Lisa Phillips to speak on legal implications of will. Again, please feel free to type questions into the chat box during the presentation. Lisa Phillips is Interim Vice President, Academic and Provost at York University and a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, where she has been on faculty since 1996. Her research on tax law, fiscal policy, gender equality, and higher education has been published widely, including a 2016 HECO publication on aligning law, policy, and practice to strengthen work-integrated learning in Ontario. Professor Phillips was appointed as special counsel within the Legal Services branch of Ontario's Ministry of Finance from January to June 2015. She has served in a variety of post-secondary leadership roles, including as Interim Dean of the Boer-Alaskan Faculty of Law at Lakehead University, Associate Vice President Research at York University, and Director of Research Policy on the board of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. She is currently appointed to the Provincial Judges Pension Board and the Board of eCampus Ontario. Lisa received her LLB from the University of Toronto and her LLM from York University. She practiced taxation law with the firm formerly known as Blake, Castles & Graydon before starting her academic career at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law in 1991. So over to you, Lisa.
Well, thank you very much. It's really great to have heard Nora's comments and to be joining you today. And this presentation that I'll give is really coming straight out of the report that I prepared with a research team for HECO in 2016. And I put the link to the report right on the slide. It's available for free on the HECO website. I'm only going to be able to touch on some high points. There's a fair bit of detail. And for those who are interested in specific legal issues, I encourage you to go and have a look at the report. The purpose of the study was really to try to map the legal landscape of work-integrated learning. We might find any resource, any literature that really pulled together certainly in an Ontario or Canadian context, all the various legal risks, rights, and responsibilities that will participants face. And by will participants, I would include students who are going into work-integrated learning settings, as well as the placement hosts, those who are inviting students into a workplace or other setting, and the post-secondary institutions themselves. All have something at stake in understanding what are the legal rights and responsibilities that exist around this area. The study also was concerned to identify what more could be done to make sure that the legal frameworks are, really well equipped to support the expansion of high-quality work-integrated learning Were there public policy moves, law reform moves that governments should be looking to make? But also, what can institutions and placement hosts be doing to be aware of, to inform students of, and to conduct themselves according to good practices for minimizing any risks and ensuring that everyone's ready to meet their responsibilities. So a framing for this report is around kind of the pros and cons, or the opportunities and potential risks surrounding work-integrated learning. I think everyone on this webinar is probably very persuaded of the case for work-integrated learning and its benefits. I won't dwell on that, but there are, of course, more critical perspectives on work-integrated learning, and they center around two areas, one of which is that there's a concern for some that work-integrated learning, if not well-structured, if not well-regulated, runs the risk of exacerbating trends towards more precarious employment in our economy. In other words, employment that is unstable, that is poorly compensated, where work conditions are not ideal, that is insecure. The other set of concerns, it's closely related, but I think worth highlighting separately, is around equity concerns. In other words, if there are some terrific will opportunities out there for students, who's gaining access to them, and is access equitable? Are we seeing that men and women have equitable access to the best kinds, the paid high quality work placements? Are there any discrimination issues that are surfacing in terms of who might face barriers to accessing those? And so for all of these concerns, law is to some extent engaged. And I am just trying to move my slide. Oh, there we are. Nope, too far, going back. Apologies, everyone. Here we are. We identified 7 areas that are most pertinent. And I've separated them out in terms of the jurisdiction because, of course, our legal system is a federal system in which the federal government has some areas of law where they legislate and control, and the provinces have others. So the top 3, employment standards, health and safety, human rights, are really the ones most frequently turning up in the work-integrated learning space. And those are all provincially regulated, which means they're going to vary across the country. We are mainly focused in the report on Ontario law. We did do some comparative research, enough to know that many of the issues also surface in other provinces. The federal areas, intellectual property, employment insurance, immigration, certainly not open to the provinces to change directly, but certainly areas where they may want to work with the federal government, which of course also has an interest in promoting work-integrated learning, and areas where it's important for will participants to be informed. And then, of course, income tax, there's some income tax incentives for co-op and other kinds of will education that exist at both the federal and provincial levels. I'm not going to be able to cover all of those in this brief presentation, but I did want to land on employment standards. So in Ontario and most other provinces, it turns out, the difficulty is that employment standards law expressly excludes individuals who are performing work under a program approved by a post-secondary institution, a college or a university. So I'm paraphrasing, this is in Section 3 of the Ontario Employment Standards Act. What is employment standards law? It's the law that regulates all of the basic conditions of work, minimum wages, maximum hours of work, the right to take breaks and vacations, the right to take emergency family or medical leaves. All of these things and more are covered in employment standards law. So this is an area that's often quite misunderstood, we found, even among people who have a very deep knowledge of work-integrated learning, folks who have been managing co-op programs for years, for instance, could still be a little confused about this area. It's a bit counterintuitive. Often the assumption is that if a student is in a paid placement, then they are like an ordinary employee, and so wouldn't they be covered by employment standards law? It turns out they're not, just because the Act explicitly excludes anyone who is doing work, whether it's paid or unpaid. under a program approved by a college or university. So that means that anything that is, important to the student, important to the host and the institution around emergency leaves or termination rights or break times or maximum hours or pay does need to be set out in some kind of agreement or set of guidelines or expectations explicitly. Some of the confusion arises from the fact that Ontario's Employment Standards Act has a set of rules known as the trainee rules. And these have gained some notoriety through cases involving unpaid internships. So this is now outside a student context where an individual not attending a college or university, but simply someone seeking work agrees to take an unpaid internship. And there are some separate rules that require that the employer be providing training, that it's for the benefit of the trainee, not for the, the workplace. And there's sometimes confusion that this must apply to work integrated learning students. Again, it doesn't, because the students are excluded from those employment standards. So that's an area where, understanding where the law stops is pretty critical. I'm going to move on to human rights law. Here, it's very clear that human rights law, and in particular anti-discrimination laws, do apply to students on work placement. That is very clear. What's less clear is how we are communicating about that with workplaces and how we are ensuring compliance or raising the chances of good compliance through good, clear expectations and students being aware of what their rights are. Students are quite vulnerable going out into a work placement. They are often the newest person on the work site. They are often anxious to get a passing evaluation of their placement, to keep their placement, for it to go well. They're worried about being able to complete their academic program, and they're also hoping often that they may have a good reference that they take away with them, or even possibly a lead into a job. And so there is potential for exploitation. There's potential for students not to feel that they can speak out about something that's not right. There's two areas in particular that I wanted to briefly land on, and that is police record checks and disability accommodation, both of which surfaced in our research, both the case law and legislative research and the interviews that we did, as areas of growing concern. So the police record checks, this is, out of a mentality, I think, of really wanting to minimize risks for placement hosts, wanting to ensure that institutions can secure placements. Colleges and universities have increasingly sought to obtain police record checks from students going out on placement. Sometimes the workplace may be requesting that. Other times the academic institution may be simply anticipating that workplaces may require this. And so the difficulty here is that police record checks, there's multiple difficulties. First of all, every police force has its own process, its own different fees. There are many delays in obtaining a police record check document. So if indeed a placement host is requiring a police record check, this can pose great difficulties of coordination in terms of the lead time that's needed to secure this. The other difficulty is there's a risk of non-conviction information being misused in discriminatory ways. So information that might have been recorded about some contact an individual student has had with police that really raises no bona fide concern about their any risks they may pose to go on a placement or their suitability for a placement. Information that might be gleaned, for instance, from a mental health apprehension, a 911 call, a random traffic stop, which we know happens more to some groups than to others. And so there have been some reported cases where individuals who had a charge that was quickly dropped, that didn't relate to any kind of concerning individual behavior by them, or simply a notation from a traffic stop where one student who was a community worker was noted to be in association or having associated with people with known criminal records. And this later turned up as a positive result on a police record check that then was used to exclude the student from going on a placement. So these can pose real concerns about legal liability for the post-secondary institution who has allowed this kind of exclusion to happen for reasons that are not legitimate. The Ontario Association of Police Chiefs actually has a terrific set of guidelines out. They've recognized that this is a concern about overuse of police record checks and also misuse of non-charge or non-conviction information in a police record. They've got some great guidelines. They've called for some legislative reform. In the meantime, I think it's incumbent on institutions to really be reflecting on, are they asking for police record checks even with a student's application for admission? And what kinds of difficulties could that get the institution into? If the college or university is then, perhaps overstating the risk that a particular student might pose, or indeed denying admission based on a positive record check that may not be justified. Pardon me. I wanted to speak briefly about disability accommodation. This is, I think, everyone who's involved with work-integrated learning has come across this one. Universities and colleges have gotten better and better at academic accommodations on our campuses. What we're less well set up for is ensuring accommodations out in a workplace setting. And here the fear that many students have of disclosing disabilities to potential placement hosts is one of our greatest challenges, because the difficulty is if a student doesn't disclose let's say an invisible disability, and then finds that when they're on placement, they're having trouble completing the work assignments in the way that is typical, that can then result in poor performance evaluations, a disappointment by the employer, and a lot greater difficulties than if the need for accommodation had been disclosed at the outset and had been accommodated. So some of the good practices that we did encounter that institutions are starting to adopt is really to have explicit written policies around how an accommodation discussion can be had. The student's right to confidentiality if they're not ready to disclose to an employer, how any accommodation costs might be shared or covered. Just making this an open topic of discussion, I think, has great potential to alleviate some of the greatest risks around this. In the interest of time, I will move straight on to employment insurance. This is an area that I think is a real, again, a potential surprise, negative surprise for students that they need to know more about. Employment insurance, of course, is you qualify for that by completing a certain number of hours of employment, of qualifying employment. You also, to get employment insurance, you have to show that you did not quit your job. You didn't quit your job voluntarily unless you had just cause to leave your position. So if you were being bullied or harassed, or there are other good reasons, just cause to leave your job, you wouldn't be denied employment insurance. The difficulty is that if a student leaves a paid job, say a part-time job that they've held throughout their studies to support themselves, if they leave that job in order to take on a placement that's related to their academic program, the court held this does not constitute just cause for quitting your job, meaning that they're disqualified from employment insurance. And so I think this would come as a shock to many. The other concern around employment insurance is simply an unpaid placement is not going to count. And even sometimes a paid placement will not count as insurable employment hours. If, for instance, the payment comes in a form that can be characterized as a scholarship or a bursary or a research grant. So moving along. To immigration law, many of us have increasing numbers of international students on our campuses, which is a very welcome development. But as we move to expand work-integrated learning, the question is, how will we ensure international students have equitable access to those opportunities? Because, of course, their study visas restrict them from working off campus. There has been some change in the direction of allowing more off-campus work by international students, up to 20 hours a week. But if we're talking about a full-time placement, that, of course, won't cover it. It's possible, in theory, to address this by obtaining a co-op work permit. What we heard in the study is that the delays for obtaining this co-op work permit can really get in the way of program completion and employer expectations. So in the short term, I think until governments get together and figure out a solution to this, I think ensuring that there are some on-campus, really high-quality work-integrated learning opportunities will be really critical for our international student populations. I will leave it there and certainly welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We're now opening the virtual floor to questions. We'll read out loud questions submitted through the chat box and engage in a conversation with our panelists. Our first question came in during Norah's presentation. Was any measure or tool used to record or assess interpersonal skills in the workplace?
Well, interpersonal skills are covered within the core. So if you look at the 10 core competencies, interpersonal skills are captured in, and I only provided you the high level. There you go. Nope, back one. There you go. So they show up in a number of ways. The interpersonal shows up in personal management, in communication, in project, task management, teamwork, professional behavior. And yeah, predominantly, and it shows up in all of those things. And a combination of where and how is a way to measure interpersonal skills. And but we have not separated them out as a separate construct that we measure or analyze in the same way that we have the intercultural.
Thanks, Norah. Our next question for Lisa. For will students being excluded from employment standards, does that apply just in Ontario?
No, we found that it's the case in other provinces as well. And the Atlantic provinces are a little bit different. It's more ambiguous in the Atlantic provinces, and for placements that are covered by the Canada Labour Code in federally regulated industries, it's more ambiguous. But in Ontario and most of the other provinces, it is the case that students who are in a workplace for an academic program are excluded.
For Norah, a couple questions came in about collecting data from others, such as peers or secondary managers or supervisors, data like reflections or reviews or ratings. Is that something that's in place?
So the data comes in from the student self-assessment and from their supervisors on the job, but we don't get data from their teamwork, their team members or peers on the job. No, we do not do that. We have the two sources of data, and all of that comes through our online database, and we have a competency module, so it's all done online and automatically. So between the coordinators and the students, they figure out the best supervisor or best person to provide the feedback from a supervisor's or employer's perspective.
Thanks. Our next question, do you have tips for engaging employers in the process of structuring and assessing a quality will experience? I guess we'll start with Norah.
Yeah, well, I think some of the tips are that what we have found over the years, and we've been implementing this for over 7 years really, is that employers need to know about what it all means. So some kind of orientation for employers and explanation is usually required. Many employers have a competency-based assessment process themselves, or they're associated with professional bodies that have competency assessments. So once you make those connections for them, they see that it's the same sort of thinking. Maybe some of the words are different. And also we have found that employers appreciate having a framework like this because it enables them to have conversations with students that really hone in on skills and development and performance in a way that is within the context of a framework and enables them to have provide meaningful feedback to students. So I think that those would be some tips, is to frame it in that way for employers and to see that it aligns often with what they're doing with performance assessments in their own place of business.
Thanks, Norah. Our next question for Lisa. A participant says, we've encountered WSIB issues with WIL placements. While expanding opportunities for international students with on-campus work, the province of Ontario will not extend WSIB coverage if students work in their home institutions. Is that a barrier that others have encountered?
So that is learning for me. I had not heard of that particular issue, and I wonder if we have any participants that want to write in about that. It's not something that I've heard about, actually.
We've got another question actually for you, Lisa. Can you elaborate on the laws surrounding on-campus WIL? So specifically the context of this participant, they operate a restaurant and event center within their hospitality school, and they've been told that students without a co-op work permit aren't eligible for on-campus placement. So could you speak a little bit more about laws on campus, with on-campus WIL?
Wow, that actually surprises me that the student, this is an international student who wouldn't be, I guess, eligible. My understanding is that on-campus work is permitted. Now, it may be that if the restaurant and event facility is operated by an independent third party, could that be the issue, I wonder? You know, if we have a student doing a WIL placement on campus, it really depends in part, I think, on who they're doing it for. So if they're working for a professor in a lab, I think that, you know, we have some pretty well-worn understandings of what that relationship is, what the agreements are around it, and, you know, if they're being paid and there's an employment contract, I think that, you know, you may well be in a regular employment situation. On the other hand, if it's a mandatory part or, you know, they're getting academic credit for it, it's part of their program, then Ontario law would exclude it, even though it's right on campus. So it's a fairly complex, you know, set of details, I think, around exactly who the employer is. Maybe it's a chain restaurant that happens to have an outlet on campus. And there again, you know, I think we're back into the same issues around, you know, employment standards law not applying, human rights law does apply, but are students in a position to understand and, you know, and do something about that if they feel there's an issue. For international students, my understanding has been that the study visa does allow for work on campus. So I am surprised to hear that there's an instance potentially of being denied the ability to do that.
Thanks, Lisa. We've got a question that perhaps both Lisa and Norah can respond to. This panelist says that we place the majority of our students in international placements, and they're curious to hear your thoughts on areas of concern and red flags. Norah, would you like to start talking about international placements?
Okay, so this is a broader question than just assessing international placements, I'm assuming, yeah? Well, of course, one concern is vetting, that it's a legitimate, meaningful experience for students, and getting, you know, ensuring that the risks have been mitigated, whatever the location happens to be. I think that's the first thing. There are, it's harder to assess sometimes when a host organization is far away and you're not familiar, perhaps, or you don't have connections that can check it out for you. So that's the first thing. I think the second one is, of course, making sure students are very well prepared. Both before they have the experience, so the standard kind of risk management training that we would do with a student, but also during the experience so that they can get the most out of it. These are very challenging situations to not only be out of an academic context and in a work experience context, that is a challenge in and of itself, but then to be away from family and friends is another challenge. And thirdly, in a context which may be quite confronting depending on the culture and where the student's coming from. So preparation before and then support capabilities during. This is why we focus on the CQ model, to help students develop and think about their intercultural effectiveness and how to develop those capabilities and navigate some of those challenges.
And Lisa, what about you? Concerns and red flags for students taking international placements?
Right, so this raises just one point I'd like to make generally, which is that ensuring that students are able to contact, students and placement hosts actually are able to contact someone at the school who is involved in managing the program is really a kind of a fundamental step that you can take, I think, to minimize all of these different kinds of risks. And, you know, in particular, knowing that there's going to be a check-in call, for instance, for the employer, or that there's somebody that they can pick up the phone and reach in the event things are not going well, either from the student or the placement host's perspective, I think it really provides a layer of, you know, of assistance to ensure that problems get surfaced early, that they don't fester, that, you know, the institution has a chance to really evaluate if this is a safe and good place for their students to be going. Certainly when students are abroad and there is any kind of emergency situation that develops in the location where they are, reaching out to them, the ability to get into contact quickly and for them to know where they need to get in touch is pretty essential.
We could have a whole session on this actually, because it's a very complicated endeavor, but one that I believe is well worth it.
Thanks to you both. A question came in for Norah about supply and demand in relation to WIL opportunities. You're speaking to us from out west in Victoria, but as you know, Ontario students, the Ontario government wants to have Ontario students have the opportunity to have at least one WIL experience during their education. Do you see a supply problem?
Well, actually, I don't. But that being said, I think we have to approach this always keeping in mind the student at the heart, that this is a learning opportunity for the student at the heart of this, and it's an educational endeavor. So that we are always keeping the needs and the quality right at the heart of what we're doing, so that we're not reacting to these very enthusiastic suggestions from governments and others, but that we're able to proceed in a way that protects the interests of the student's academic journey. Now, that being said, we're all in this space together. Yes, we're all out. I'm in Victoria. Only 45% of our placements are in the Victoria area. The rest are everywhere else, including Ontario. So we're all kind of in this together. And I think it's important that collectively we approach this with some key quality indicators that we all try and stick with and speak to employers about, so that employers are able to provide opportunities which are in line with what we're looking for. And I think by approaching this in a collective and thoughtful manner, there isn't going to be a supply and demand problem, but we also need to work with our employers to build up capacity. And what I talk about specifically are the small to medium enterprises. You know, we don't have to worry about the Royal Banks and the others because they've really got a handle on this. But most of the Canadian labor market is made up of small to medium enterprise. That's where most of the jobs are. So what can we do collectively to build up the capacity of those employers and organizations so that they can legitimately take on students, provide them with a quality experience, and get the benefit from that, which is actually a win-win. But that can be easier said than done. And I think to offset or prevent a problem where everyone's running around competing against each other and fighting for existing opportunities, which what I worry about is that the pendulum will then swing in about 5 years and it'll be, oh, let's not do any of this anymore. It's created too much chaos. And I think that's what we want to do. We want to take the long view and make sure that that does not happen.
Thank you, Norah. Another question for you. Have you looked at long-term employment outcomes of WIL grads?
Yes, there's research on that. I'm trying to think of if I can point to an actual reference to provide to somebody, but there has been some research on long-term employment outcomes. You know, both the province of BC and Ontario does 2-year out graduate surveys and 5-year out graduate surveys. That's the source of some of that data. I would also recommend, there's the journal, if anyone's particularly interested in this, there's the newly named International Journal for Work Integrated Learning. Used to be the Asia Pacific Journal for Cooperative Education, but they've just got renamed, which is great. They have it's all online. It's a very good searchable database. I'd go to that journal and search that topic and see what you can find, because there's been some research in other jurisdictions, for example, Australia, which might be helpful to answer that question.
Thanks. We've got another question for both of you, and we'll start with Lisa. The legal and administrative policies are complex and they're often shifting. Do you have suggestions about the best ways to communicate this kind of information to faculty and programs so that they can ensure they are complying with the policies?
You know, I think the most helpful thing I've seen are really some brochures and quick tips about expectations for all parties that really cover not necessarily the details of the law, but rather what the expectations are in a accessible kind of plain language format that is easy to digest. Things like, you know, there needs to be a written job description for the position, that there needs to be, you know, supervision of the student, that the placement will be evaluated by the school after the fact through talking with the student about the quality of the placement, that things like work hours should be discussed and agreed upon in advance. So I would say that that kind of approach of trying to set up clear expectations at the outset and then maintaining contact, making it clear that employers, placement hosts, and students can reach out to somebody and are encouraged to do so at any time should they have a question or an issue with how the placement is going, are, I think, the best risk reduction strategies that I've seen thus far. It's absolutely the case that the law is really complicated. It's very dependent on the specifics of the situation. And so trying to provide legal advice to students or even legal information, I think is tricky because, you know, if their situation is a little different, you know, the general information just may not apply. One possible answer around this is for universities, at least, that have legal clinics on campus. You know, those legal clinics themselves have students who are doing work integrated learning within them, and may be potentially a resource around some of the issues that students might encounter. I know that at York University, the legal clinic at Osgoode Hall Law School, for instance, has in some cases assisted students who have been blocked from completing a placement, have had difficulties on placement, and are being told they may not succeed on the placement. So it may be that's a potential resource for students. But I would say that rather than trying to provide legal advice, I would try to provide preventive information about good practices and clear expectations up front.
I'd just add a comment. Just as previously I commented on collaborating to work with our employer communities, I think it's really important in this space to be collaborating internally, because what's very risky is if you have faculty members from a faculty X running around with a particular WIL program, and then you've got another program over in another faculty, and they're not on the same page with understanding the risks and responsibilities that Lisa has so very nicely pointed out, and people are doing different things, then you're in real trouble. So making sure there's some kind of collective approach on campus, which I do realize can sometimes be easier said than done.
Thank you to you both. We've got time for one last question, and I think it may be more for Norah than for Lisa. What would you recommend, what kinds of alternative strategies for students who aren't successful in getting a co-op, for instance? What other kinds of WIL experiences would you recommend, or other strategies?
If they're not successful in getting a co-op, well, you know, we are entering, and we know this, a future where students need to be much more agentic in creating their own opportunities. So that could be various forms of entrepreneurship. That could be various forms of projects that they take on their own, whatever you call it. Because entrepreneurship can sometimes feel like, oh, that's just for business students. But it could be any kind of experience where they're actually trying to create that opportunity for themselves because they haven't been able to find an opportunity that's been provided to them. And increasingly, our graduates are going to be facing that future. So it's actually not a bad thing if it can be supported appropriately, and students provided with some of those tools, so that they are able to take some of those steps to create their own opportunity if one doesn't come through the co-op office, for example.
Thank you, Norah. So given that we're close to the end of the hour, we'd like to thank our terrific panelists, Lisa Phillips and Norah McRae, for their time this afternoon, or morning, I guess, on Norah's side of Canada. And to all of our attendees for the terrific questions. We weren't able to get to all of them, but there was a great diversity coming in. Want to send a reminder that the recording and the slides from this webinar will be shared on HECO's website. And we'll be able to communicate that to attendees when it's up. And we'd also like to give a plug for our next webinar taking place in a little over a month's time, Monday, April 23rd, at the same time, 12 to 1 Eastern, on rubric adaptation, how to customize your assessment tools. And we'll have two great panelists, Dr. Brian Frank and Dr. Terrell Rose. So stay tuned for information from HECO so that you may register and sign up. But for now, you can save the date. Thanks again to Lisa and Norah, and thanks to all of you for signing on. Have a great rest of your day, a great first day of spring.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.